Okay, we're back. So, like we did with the plants, let's start with a transitional group of protists that phylogenetically we know is very closely related to the animals, the closest living relative of anything on Earth that's not an animal. And this group is called the choanoflagellates, or the choanoflagellata. Choano means collar. Flagellata refers to the unusual flagellum. And so it's basically a single-celled protist. You can see its nucleus that has this weird flagellum with a collar around it. And sometimes these are called collar cells because it looks like the collar around the neck where your head would be the flagellum. Um, they are protists. They're kind of weird group of protists that no one really cared about up until the time we started using DNA to build phylogenies, and then it turned out this group was very closely related to animals. And when we get to animals in a few seconds, you'll see why it makes perfect sense that these are closely related to them. Um, they all live in the oceans. They're saltwater, and they feed as suspension feeders, basically moving water with their flagellum in order to capture algae. And that's all I'm going to say about them. They're more important for what they're related to rather than how they live. So this is what they look like. Sometimes they're solitary. Sometimes they can form a small colony of cells, but all the cells are exactly the same except for maybe a stalk. Um, and so they can move their flagella back and forth and in the process move water. And the water is going to have phytoplankton in it, like diatoms, and it will eat those diatoms and algae. So that's them. Now let's see the first group of animals, and you'll see a lot of similarities. So this first group are called the sponges. They're in the phylum Porifera. You don't need to know their technical name, but the name means it has holes. And these are a multicellular group of animals. And basically, their big innovation is different kinds of cells, specialized cells. And so in a choanoflagellate, all the cells are the same, but in a sponge, you've got feeding cells, reproductive cells, structural support cells, all kinds of different cells whose job is to work together as a single organism. We call sponges cell grade because they do not have tissues. There's no true skin or muscles or nerves or connective tissue. They're just a bunch of specialized cells. And so they're hardly an animal at all. They're barely an animal. They can't move, they can't feel, they can't think, they don't have a nervous system, they don't really have any organs at all. Okay, they do produce sperm and eggs, but they do it at the cell level. So they're cell grade. The body, if you want to call it that, because it's really weird. Is it a single organism or is it a colony of single cells? It blurs the line a bit, but there's holes throughout the body, and that's the root of the name, the porifera. They reinforce their cells with little crystals called spicules, which are kind of like microscopic bricks that help tie the cells together. And they can be either a special kind of mineral or maybe a protein. If it's a protein, the body will be flexible, like proteins are. If it's a mineral, the body is going to be crunchy and kind of more solid. Like the choanoflagellates, they feed as colonial suspension feeders, sitting on the seafloor or attached to a rock or something else. And then they move water currents through their body, through the holes in their body, with specialized flagella that are called collar cells that are inside the body. And then in the process, that water has algae in it and they eat the algae. They mostly reproduce asexually, but again, occasionally, either induced by stress or lots of energy available and the right conditions, they can switch to sexual reproduction. as well. And except for one group that lives in freshwater, they are a marine or saltwater group of life. So that's the sponges. Let me give you some details so you can understand them, and then I think we'll call this module done as well. So if we took a sponge and cut it in half, and again, they don't have nerves, so you can do this. They won't feel it. They won't function correctly, but they won't be in pain. They have holes or pores in their body, and inside are these cells that are called collar cells that look like a quantiflagellate. In fact, that's why we feel confident that you take a quantiflagellate cell and add a bunch of different kinds of specialized cells, and now you're an animal. So again, the evolution of animals is pretty simple. Take a weird protist, have different kinds of cells evolve, different variability, and now you're functioning as an animal. It's attached to the seafloor or to something. It pulls water in with these collar cells and eats the algae. And there's different kinds of cells. Some that's functioning as evolutionarily a precursor to skin, other ones that are tying everything together. There are other cells involved in reproduction, all kinds of stuff. And then that water gets pushed out through what's called a chimney. And so here you could take some dye and kind of put it outside of a sponge and let the sponge pull that water in. And in a few seconds, that water with potentially the food, in this case the dye, gets pulled through the body wall and then passes out. So this is the world of a sponge. They're very simple, but incredibly sophisticated. If you look closely in the body wall, so this is kind of the cells of the body. Here's some of the holes close up. You can see these little tiny, what look like hairs or eyelashes, but these are crystals of either calcium carbonate or glass or protein, and they're embedded throughout the body, helping glue everything together. They're produced by the cells. You could argue spicules are a synapomorphy of the sponges. In fact, they are. Um, and once you have these ingredients, specialized feeding cells, cells that can reproduce, cells that allow the organism to build its body, then you can be a small sponge or you can be a gigantic sponge. And really, this is what makes an animal an animal. Um, what you think of as a sponge, if it looks like these ones here at the bottom, irregularly organic shaped, those were the spicules of the protein skeleton of a sponge. They ripped it off the seafloor, put it in a bucket with some bleach to kill everything off, and what you're left with is the protein. If you have a sponge that looks like SpongeBob SquarePants, that's more square, that's plastic. That's not real animal. Okay? But these sponges, next time you're taking a nice kind of luxurious, relaxing bath and you suds up with one of these sponges, again, just remind yourself you've just used the skeleton of a once living organism to relax with. The big innovations of sponges is that they're the first animals. And so they might not seem like a lot, but they do some really important stuff. So the big trends are we now have different kinds of cells, animal cells, feeding cells, all heterotrophic, working together. And so that transition to multicellularity is a really important one in the evolution of what it means to be an animal. So let's, okay. Now, all of the remaining animals, if you're a sponge, your body doesn't really have an organization to it. There's just kind of it could be a blob of cells with some holes and pores and spaces and cavities. All of the rest of the animals take what sponges had and then are going to organize the cells in more sophisticated ways to make tissues, muscle, connective, nervous, epithelial, and then build organs. And then when you build animals this way, then your body's going to look very, very differently. The group of animals we're going to turn to next have these tissues, they have the organs, maybe different organs, but they all are built from the same kinds of tissues. And this next group of life is called the metazoa. meaning the higher animals in a way. Um, and so they're defined by the synapomorphy of tissues and organs. And so depending on how those tissues and organs are put together, you can come in two different versions of metazoan. The one is radially symmetrical, and this is including the jellyfish and the sea anemones and the corals, um, and they're radially symmetrical, kind of like a pizza. You can cut it in half and it's a mirror image. Okay, the upside and the downside are different, but at least side to side, there's no right side or a left side, or even a head, really. They're radially symmetrical. They have a body orientation. The bilateria is the other way of being a metazoan, where they have a right side and a left side, and that's the only way you can cut the animal in half and make a mirror image. So there's a right side and a left side, and that's what the word bilateria means. Bi means two, lateral means sides, so two sides. And typically they also have a head at the front or the anterior end, and a tail or something like a tail, or the loss of a tail at the posterior end. And then they also have a backside or a dorsal side, and a belly side or a ventral side. And so you're a bilaterian, as are most of the animals that you're familiar with, bilaterally symmetrical. So all of the worms are bilaterally symmetrical, as are all of the things with bones and fishes, and even things like clams that have a right side and a left side. They have two shells. So let's put this on a phylogeny. And here you'll see that I've left all the words off, just like you might see on the final exam. And I want you to see the evolution of what it means to be an animal. We start off with the Choanoflagella, a protist group. Everything else is in that clade called Animalia. And then we're not going to give you the synapomorphies of what it means to be an animal, but then we can break off into the first group, which are the sponges. And then all of the rest have our four groups of animal tissues, and with that, organs. And these are the metazoans. Then within the metazoa, we're going to have two different ways of being a metazoan. The first group are the radially symmetrical groups, and that's the jellyfish and corals and things like that. And there's several groups of these. We're only going to cover one. And then everything else is the bilateria, or the bilaterally symmetrical animals. And they're defined by bilateral symmetry and a ton of other stuff. A head, a right side, a left side, and a bunch of things we'll talk about. So most animals that you're familiar with are bilaterians or metazoans.